seminars in the series over the year. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our stars for the evening, Jen Mansfield and Gillian Kidman, who are going to be talking about their research, the work they've been doing recently. Jen will be speaking about her recently completed PhD, exploring the notion of equilibrium, certainty, uncertainty, and its impact on practice. And Gil will be speaking about her ongoing work into inquiry and its impact on practice or learning and teaching in science. So it's a bit of a 2-for-1 deal tonight, so you're very lucky. And I'll hand over to Jen to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Hello, thank you all for coming out tonight. I'd like to share with you some of my research, and my recently completed PhD research. And so it all started because when I was working as a secondary school science teacher, I used to get really frustrated and annoyed when people would suggest teaching's easy. I knew teaching wasn't easy, and I get frustrated at the suggestion. Teachers exist and function in really complex environments. And so this notion that teaching is easy, I really wanted to challenge that idea. We know that teachers exist in very complex environments and that they develop a very special and unique kind of knowledge and understanding about their particular environments. You'd know this particular knowledge. It's that knowledge you have because you know the little boy that sits in the front row. You know that you need to move him from point A to point B. You make decisions about the types of pedagogies you would use to help that little boy along his learning journey. And it's the decisions that you make and the understanding you have when you look at that little boy and the work that he's doing as to whether or not he's actually achieving what it is that you're hoping that he will learn. And all of this is happening all at once in your head. But to the casual observer who thinks that teaching is easy, who sees teaching as a series of activities, isn't privy to what's going on in the teacher's mind. And what's going on behind the teacher's eyes is all of this complex reasoning that this teacher has, not only for that little boy, but for the 28 other students that they have in their classroom. And so teaching, rather than being a series of problems that need solving, it's actually a series of dilemmas that need managing, because we can't always solve all of the problems. Teaching is problematic, it's very dilemma-based, and so we have to manage these dilemmas. So this knowledge, this special, unique knowledge that teachers develop, let's call it a professional knowledge of practice, because it is special and unique. Teachers are professionals and they develop this special knowledge. We want to know more about this professional knowledge of practice because we know that it's important for teachers' decision making. But we know a few things about it, few people research in this space. We know it develops over time and through experiences. But we also know that it's tacit, it's intuitively created, and therefore it's very difficult to articulate and share. As a consequence, teachers are often underappreciative of this knowledge themselves. They're unable to articulate it, they're unable to share it, and as a consequence, we don't tend to value it. And so the casual observer who thinks teaching is easy, if the teacher can't articulate the complexities of their knowledge, it makes it understandable that people would think it is more simple than it is. So why then? How does this knowledge develop? How can we learn more about this knowledge if it is tacit? It's difficult to articulate and capture and share. It's undervalued. How can we then start to explore in this space? It's pretty tricky. Well, there is a possible way. We can start to look at when that knowledge is actually in action. And what I mean by that is when you function in a space of routine, where you can bring existing knowledge and skills and routine to bear on a situation, you can actually manage it. But when you hit the limits of that knowledge, you start to feel a sense of, oh, stop and think, because that signals to you the limits of your knowledge and where new knowledge is abound. And so if we think about these little interruptions, these things that make us stop and think, that signal to us the limits, the boundaries of our knowledge, they actually present us with opportunities. Because this tacit knowledge that we normally aren't able to capture automatically Now we have this opportunity, this glimpse into the development of this knowledge of practice. So this could potentially be a space in which we could start to see the knowledge develop. And so with this in mind, I went out. Actually, you would recognise these moments. They look a lot like this. Those moments where you stop and think, those moments where you don't quite know how to act, those moments where you have to make a decision, but is it this decision or this decision or this decision? How do I weigh up the options? Can I phone a friend? Where's my nearest colleague? How can I find out? That uncertainty that you might feel, that perplexion, that surprise or curiosity. Sound familiar? Have you encountered these moments in your practice? So these moments signal to us our knowledge in action, where new knowledge is abounds. And this idea of discontent or uncertainty as being a necessary precursor for knowledge development isn't anything new. I mean, Thomas Edison suggested that discontent is is a necessity of progress. So it's not necessarily a new idea. But how can we then apply this to teaching, to start to research how teachers' professional knowledge of practice develops? So I drew on this idea because I really wanted to challenge these notions teaching is easy, and I wanted to know more about my own practice and how it developed and how we can share our knowledge of practice. So I drew on some work by some researchers in the States, Sutherland and her colleagues, and they suggested a construct called pedagogical discontent. Now, I used the word pedagogical discontent once in the staff room, and one of the senior members of staff told me if I used that word again, I would no longer be allowed in the staff room. And so I learned very early not to use these big words while I was teaching. But now I'm a researcher, I feel I have a bit more liberty. So this idea of pedagogical discontent, big word, but all it means is that when what you intend to do for teaching doesn't necessarily align with what you actually do, you can feel a sense of discontent. So I thought that's pretty good. I could go out and I could ask teachers about their discontent because it's memorable, because it's unsettling. Great. So I went and I asked 15 participants to recall moments of discontent, and they had lots of moments of discontent that they were happy to talk about. And what we found was that unsettling moments interrupt us and make us stop and think. That we already knew, and that teachers were saying yes during their practice, that was what was happening. Teachers were often saying, yes, these could be negative moments. Yes, they could make me feel discomfort in a negative way. So it could cause confusion, it could cause a degree of uncertainty that could be described as negative. But what was unexpected was teachers were saying, oh no, it's not discontent, that's not what it is. I just feel uncertain. I just didn't know how to act. But what was really new and novel about this particular research was teachers actually said they felt positive. They felt unsettled, but in a really positive sense. And in this space, they said they felt positive because they developed a new sense of agency because of something that had happened in the classroom. And they thought, oh, I want to do that more. The kids are interested. I want to do this. And how am I going to be able to do this to take them on this journey on the fly during the classes they were going? And they said this was surprising. It wasn't negative. I still feel unsettled, but it's positive. Great. This was a great finding. But it then made me experience researcher discontent because the word I was using to describe these moments was inherently negative. Discontent implies negativity, that I'm not content. I'm thinking, well, that doesn't really describe what my participants are telling me. And so I needed a new word. So I went to the research literature and I had a look at some work by a philosopher called English in 2013, and she suggested the term interruption. And an interruption is something that makes us stop and think. It demands our attention. You can be interrupted negatively, you can be interrupted positively. And so the word interruption seemed to fit better. Great, I had a word. Now I need to think of a way in which I can talk about the nature of these interruptions. So I drew on another researcher. You may have heard of him as a chap named Piaget. Now Piaget suggests, he was researching in the space of cognitive development, and he suggests that we develop our knowledge and understanding through schema. We develop these schema through the processes of assimilation and accommodation, where we accommodate new schema into existing schema. So when any of us come across something new, we feel a sense of disequilibrium because we have to then either assimilate or accommodate that new information into our existing schema. So when this happens, this disequilibration happens, we feel a sense of, I want to return to a state of stability. I want to return to a state of equilibrium. And that drives the process of assimilation and accommodation. Now, Piaget was a biologist. And I'm a biologist, so I kind of liked what he was saying. I liked his use of language. And so I've drawn on this to see if I can use this to describe what it was I was seeing with these interruptions. So how about this? If we're operating within a sense of equilibrium, we're operating in a space where we feel certainty, where we can manage the inherent daily dilemmas by bringing our routine existing knowledge to bear on new situations, and we can manage them intuitively. They don't make us stop and think. We can handle that. But when an interruption occurs that forces our attention and makes us stop and think, that signals the limits of our knowledge and understanding, we feel a challenge to our equilibrium. And that makes us go into this feeling of uncertainty, surprise, perplexity, and curiosity. And so rather than disequilibrium, which again, dis would imply negative, it's more of a challenge to equilibrium. And so unfortunately, I came up with a term that would get me kicked out of the staff room again. Pedagogical equilibrium is how I use to describe this. And I'm suggesting from what I was seeing from the teachers, that teachers are constantly searching for a state of pedagogical equilibrium. And it seemed as though they were searching for this equilibrium more often than they were attaining this equilibrium, which was very interesting as well. So if we think about these particular interruptions, what did they look like? Well, the interruptions tended to be either internally or externally manifested. They occurred because of something the teacher did. Either, do I have enough content knowledge? Do I not have enough content knowledge? Did I say something that sort of led it in a different direction? Or was it something that a student did in the class? Did the student say something? Is there something in my school context? It could be isolated, so a one-off. For example, one of the participants said the student came in and sprayed deodorant all over the desk. So it could be isolated or it could be prolonged due to some kind of simmering tension within the teacher's context. So if we now look at the nature, where these interruptions were occurring in a teacher's practice, I found that there were 4 big areas, and you'd probably recognise these. One of the areas where teachers searched for equilibrium was with their content knowledge. This is the what. What am I teaching? Do I have enough of it or don't I have enough of it? Teachers searched for equilibrium when they were organising for learning. So this is the how. How am I going to teach? How am I planning to teach? Do I have these pedagogies? How am I going to manage assessment? Organising for teaching. When teachers were organising for learning, they searched for equilibrium. And this was when they started to think about why. Why will I teach this content in this particular way? What is it that I know about my students or my context? And the 4th one, which was rather external, was with student motivation, attitudes and behaviours. And this was very much about learner consent. Is the learner consenting to come to the table? Is the learner motivated and engaged? Is the learner consenting to the learning journey? And this was often a source of challenge for equilibrium for teachers as well. And so I'd like to look at the 2 middle themes now in a bit more detail. In particular, the search for equilibrium when teachers were organising for teaching, because this was a really big area where teachers experienced challenge to equilibrium. And there were 4 big ideas in this particular chapter. In the first one, teachers experienced challenge to equilibrium when they were planning for teaching, finding pedagogies. Is this pedagogy going to be effective? Creating them, creating things to try and engage student interest. And then they wanted to share and collaborate. Oh, I might get someone's help on this one, or, oh, this was great, I'll share this with the team. And so that tended to be a challenge to equilibrium. Teachers struggled with the difference between teacher-centred and learner-centred. A lot of teachers had a big sense of agency because they wanted to teach more student-centred, but struggled to understand how they would be able to do that effectively. And so some teachers, for example, one of the music teachers, she said, do I teach more content or skill mastery? And she was struggling between the 2. teachers mentioned that they often had a crowded curricula to deal with and struggled with different strategies. Teachers also search for equilibrium when trying to balance depth versus breadth. I have this curricula, I have this amount of time. What will I emphasise in more detail than others? Will something have to be negotiated? And this was a big source of challenge to equilibrium for teachers. And then, of course, assessment and testing. Many of the teachers mentioned NAPLAN, and many of the teachers mentioned high-stakes testing, like in senior years of science and senior years of schooling. They also experienced challenge to equilibrium when creating or even finding different types of assessment. And one overarching theme with all of these was teachers mentioned contextual constraints were very influential on challenging their equilibrium when they were organising for teaching. Now, when teachers were organising for learning, this was more because they knew something about their students and they specifically wanted to plan with their students in mind. And here there were three big themes. Teachers felt a challenge to equilibrium when they wanted to make their teaching and learning relevant to their students' everyday lives, either because they knew something about their students or because they knew that this was a fruitful avenue for teaching. Teachers also wanted to search for equilibrium when they tried to make different tasks that were accessible to many. So they knew their student body and they wanted to develop certain skills or a challenge to develop a range of skills in their students, but make it accessible to a number of students on different levels. And then teachers really wanted to cater for student individual needs. With 28 students in the class, that's a big ask. And so what I found was there was increasing awareness across here because of the student need, the teacher's agency. I really want to address that child's need and that child's need and that child's need. But they searched for equilibrium because they found that challenging within their dynamic contexts. Now, being that we're talking about science, I thought I would share with you some of the data from 6 of my participants that were science specialists. They were science teachers. And I wanted to look at whether there was maybe some themes within the science participants in particular. And I did find some. There were 3. Science teachers felt that they experienced a challenge to equilibrium with externally administered exams. And up to a couple of years ago, the high-stakes testing in Year 12, there were 2 science exams for each of the subjects. Science teachers in particular, also felt that preparing and undertaking practical work and also planning and implementing scientific investigations was a challenge to their equilibrium. And I'd like to share with you some of the teacher voice now in these particular areas. So Roger was a very interesting participant. Roger was an experienced biology and science teacher and a head of department in his school. And Roger had a very developed sense of agency about what he wanted his students to learn. And this, I think, is quite indicative. Roger feels very disappointed about external exams because he wants his student to be skillful, knowledgeable, resilient, creative. But we don't examine that. And so Roger felt a challenge to equilibrium because he wanted to instill these qualities in his students, and yet we don't have an exam that actually examines that. And he felt that a real challenge. When we were looking at practical work, Peter was a young graduate student. He was in his first couple of years of teaching, and he wanted to contextualise science with his Year 8s. And so he decided to run an energy-efficient house project with his Year 8s. And he said quite often they were engaged in the project. He was really excited about the level of engagement of these particular students. But he felt a challenge to equilibrium because he said it wasn't necessarily effective at developing understanding about physics. He could tell him that they had solar panels and they had insulation, but they couldn't actually explain the concepts of thermal exchange. And so Peter, sometimes when we try to do things, where does engagement meet effectiveness? Peter felt a challenge to equilibrium. The students were engaged, they loved the project, but it didn't achieve what it was he was hoping it would achieve. And back to Roger again. Roger was creating a Year 9 science elective. It was a science of new materials, and he wanted to look at the atom, ideas of chemistry, and then spring out into nanotech. He said, but he's a biologist, an earth scientist, so he's going to have to learn a bit of the content here. So it challenged Roger's feeling of equilibrium. He really wanted to have ideas at the cutting edge, relevant to real world, and really open these kids up to this new and exciting world of science, this cutting edge stuff. But he said, hang on, but I've got to write it as well as teach all my other classes. He also said, I had to get out of my comfort zone. And this is one of those really good moments of pedagogical, of challenge to pedagogical equilibrium. It's positive because he said, this is great. I am loving this. I feel unsettled. I feel a challenge to my equilibrium, but I'm loving it because I'm getting to do this. I don't necessarily know it all, but he was having a really good time. And so that was very interesting too. And so one of the happy consequences of actually exploring this was the development of a framework for actually representing these interruptions in some sort of format that could be read. And so the SRCL Representation Framework, again, big words, they won't let me back in the staff room with this, sets out to try and dissect and really articulate what was happening. And so it starts off with the situation, which tries to articulate the context of what was happening. It then details what happened, what was the reaction, what did the teacher do, what did the students do, and what was the consequence of this that happened. The last part was the learning, and it's very important to ask teachers about their learning, to try and articulate their learning, because it helps make them more aware of the knowledge that they're actually creating. And one of the very interesting things that came from this was that what the teachers felt they learnt was often different to what I think they learnt. I think they learnt more than what they thought they had. And I thought, what a great opportunity to be able to share this with a critical friend, to say, hey, critical friend, did you see you learnt this here? Did you notice that you did this and this? What a fantastic opportunity to be able to share that and build the expertise between teachers. And so how does this then actually challenge notions of science, teaching and learning? Well, firstly, challenges to equilibrium result in learning. These are commonplace and natural, yet we don't tend to recognise and celebrate these moments. So I want you to think about, does this resonate with you at all? What does this mean for you? Have you experienced moments that challenge your sense of equilibrium? And what do you do in these moments? Because another educational researcher, John Dewey, suggests we often try to avoid these situations. We try and rush past them or through them because they cause us discomfort. And so we try either avoid it or not go there. But there are moments that I'm suggesting, and I'm challenging that and saying, well, actually, these are really valuable moments that we need to be celebrating, embracing and working through. Because what happens is that when we start off with a challenge to equilibrium, we don't go back to the same equilibrium. Because learning is involved, we attain a new state of equilibrium. And so with every successive challenge to equilibrium, whether big or small and overlapping, learning is taking place. This is part of the essential learning journey. And so really we should be embracing this. And so what does this mean then for you as teachers? Well, firstly, challenges to equilibrium are commonplace. And I'd like to challenge that and say and embrace these moments because they highlight your knowledge in action. They let you know the learning that you're actually doing. They alert you to it and demand your attention. We can create a culture of learning in the classroom. My youngest child was in prep last year and he came home and he said, Mum, my teacher says, it's all right, mistakes are part of learning. So I've got this, Mum, it's okay. How good is that? Mistakes are part of learning. She had given him, in that small phrase, permission to play in this messy space. How awesome. What a great phrase. And I would extend that by saying interruptions are part of learning. It gives us permission to play in that space. Representing your experiences in a framework like the SRCL could be beneficial for you for articulating, sharing your challenges to interruption. Employing the help of a critical friend could help you identify areas where you may not necessarily recognise your learning. But another thing, challenges to equilibrium actually start our inquiry process. They make us question our practice. And so inquiry into our practice, I'd like to hand over to the inquiry guru.
Thanks, Jen. And I do hope you can hear me. It's the best it's going to get. And I do apologise. Inquiry is my favourite word. And you've probably heard it many, many times. It's there in our curriculum and it's in everyday language. So what we're actually looking at is the impact that the inquiry is having on the teacher themselves. But what you've heard about, probably in the past, is inquiry-based teaching, where the teacher actually gives the permission to the child to start questioning and to start their learning process. You probably also heard about inquiry-based learning. That's where the child actually does the investigations. Perhaps you've considered the nexus between the two. Have you heard about inquiry skills? What about science inquiry skills? Familiar terms? Unfortunately, that's not what we're talking about tonight, because all of that is what we're familiar with, and it's centred towards the child. It's the teacher's pedagogy, it's the child's actual actions within the classroom. What we're looking at is an inquiry approach to teaching. It's a new idea, but this is what the teacher is actually doing in Jen's study. They're about to launch into an inquiry about themselves, where they are the focus of the work, not the science content knowledge itself and not the science skills. So the focus is shifted from the teaching pedagogy and from the child onto the actual teacher themselves. It starts with the teacher experiencing the challenge, and the teacher has to be receptive. They have to be in a state where they can say, oh, that was good, what can I learn from it? Or, oh, that didn't go so well, what can I learn for it? And they have to be in a situation where they're going to actually pay attention to their own thoughts. We can also have it there specific to science, because that's what we're here tonight for. So generic skills, but then also honing in on the science teaching as well. So the premise of this new idea that we're putting forward of inquiry approach to science is that the teacher needs to be actively involved in the learning about their teaching. Not necessarily the science content. It's about themselves and their own practice. So our particular framework that encompasses a new idea of inquiry has 4 particular elements to it, and a nice little model as well. What I'd like to do now, if I can, is unpack each of the 4 elements one by one. The teacher has to actually start by creating the need to know. They have to be receptive. They have to have consent. They have to take it on board. Something has happened in their teaching. There's been this little bit of a disruption, and they have to want to run with it. Once they're through that, they actually have to start probing the issue. They have to say to themselves all these different types of questions. And we know from our own experience that questioning is at the heart of teaching and at the heart of inquiry. But notice the different format here on the questions. It's not about the science content, it's about what happened with the teaching. So why is this an issue? What caused the issue? What would be a solution? Multiple solutions, perhaps. And what are the consequences? The teacher's asking these questions. They're perhaps asking them with a critical friend in mind. They're perhaps going to the internet. They could be just mulling over it themselves. But the questions are being asked, the information is being sought. They then start to make connections and make sense of what they're thinking about. How does this relate to previous activities that I've been teaching? Where am I going to use it in the future? And then they have to reflect. We all know as teachers, reflection is really important. But with this particular reflection, it's what have I learnt? Where can I go forward in the future? They're the 4 stages. And as Jen alluded to, the a few moments ago, once you've been challenging this state of discontent or this disruption, you don't go back to your original starting point. You go back towards the beginning, but it's at a different level because you've learnt something along the way. So a new question forms, a new issue is investigated. And so the teacher, as they're probing what is happening in the classroom, is becoming more and more knowledgeable about themselves as a teacher, about their teaching practice, and they keep going around and around. So they've got this inquiry approach to their actual teaching. So we'd like to put forward that we have inquiry-based teaching, we have inquiry-based learning. We've got inquiry skills, but we've also got an inquiry approach to teaching. And Jen, why is that important?
Well, it's important because when we start inquiring, particularly into our practice, inquiring is what scientists do. So when we start inquiring, we're actually working like scientists. We're posing a question and we're seeking to find an answer to that particular question. And so we engage in the processes of inquiry and investigation into our own learning and practice, but we do it in these very dynamic but collaborative environments. So I want to draw your attention now and make a parallel to the Australian curriculum. Now the new Victorian curriculum, which is being implemented at the end of this year in a lot of places, actually draws from this. But there are two strands in particular that I would like to draw a parallel between my work and Gillian's work. And that is the science as a human endeavour strand and the science inquiry skills strand. Because as teachers, when we inquire into our practice, we're actually modelling a lot of the processes of science that we want to be teaching to our students and have our students appreciate. So if we look at Gillian's work, when we start to model these, we're actually, as teachers, questioning. We're processing and analysing information and we're communicating that with others. We're inquiring into our practice. And in a sense, my work can draw some parallels to the science as a human endeavour strand, particularly the nature of science, the nature and development of science. In particular, mistakes and uncertainty are important precursors for learning. This is commonplace as scientists. Quite often school science doesn't reflect how real science is done. Yet as a scientist, having worked as a scientist, mistakes and uncertainty were very commonplace when I was a scientist. And yet in school science, it tends to be about a recipe-style prac or a prac that works. We don't tend to celebrate the prac that doesn't work. We tend to fear the prac that doesn't work. And so mistakes and uncertainty are actually important precursors for learning. So are we celebrating the process or are we celebrating the product? And so by thinking of our practice in this way, if we think about the development of our professional knowledge of practice as being through these challenges to equilibrium, which are commonplace but messy, a little bit like the pinball reasoning that Deb and Kirsty talked about in the last session. That pinball reasoning is messy. It's a messy space to be in, but it seems to be an essential place for us to actually be in to develop our knowledge and understanding. Another way in which this is very similar to the nature of science is that if we develop a learning culture where uncertainty is commonplace and necessary and could be developed and nurtured, and we can model this for our students, we can actually model the nature of knowledge development in the classroom. Creativity and imagination are essential for science work. They're also essential for teachers' work. How often do you have to be creative and imaginative with your pedagogies? How often do you need to be creative and imaginative with your assessment? How often do you need to be creative and imaginative with the way you manage students? You do it all the time. Scientists have to be creative and imaginative as well. We want our science students to be creative and imaginative too. We want to model the nature of knowledge development, how that knowledge actually develops. Teaching and learning is actually a human endeavour. Teaching, like science, is a human endeavour. It's very collaborative, it's very based on other people. And collaboration and sharing is actually a means of developing expertise. And we can do this when we start to talk about, put a language onto the development of our knowledge of practice. When we talk about it and share it, we can actually share this expertise, not only with in-service teachers, but also with pre-service teachers and teacher educators as a way of helping to develop teachers' knowledge of practice. And so in this way, we're actually very much modelling the similar processes to the nature of science development. And I would challenge that and say, well, actually, teaching as a human endeavour is also something that we could consider and challenge. And so in this way, we're hoping that our work actually challenges the notions of science, teaching and learning. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's right.
Join me up here.
You just come answer
Right,
questions.
so I'm asking Jen and Gil to join me because it's over to you guys. It's time for any questions you may have. I just have a couple of small favours to ask. When you do ask a question, if you wouldn't mind standing up, and if you could also, I'm going to hand you the mic as well. So because we're recording, so give us a big smile, use your best teacher voice, and yeah, no pressure. Questions? You'd love to kick us off.
Hi, Dr. Len Halpern, recent graduate of Monash University Education and currently teaching at Williamstown High School, Year 10 and 11 Science and Maths. Jen, in your research, did you notice any difference between science teachers who had sort of gone straight through in their careers to be teachers, or who had been out in a previous career, maybe in science?
Not particularly with my research, Len, but anecdotally I have found, just from teaching experience, that life experience can actually be really beneficial for teachers. But that's a really good area in which I would like to actually go back and look at my data and see if there was. Just off the top of my head, I can't remember. One of the participants maybe. But no, I hadn't actually thought of that, Lynn, but it's something that I have been thinking about because I actually didn't go on the straight through trajectory, and I wondered what influence my life experience had on myself as a teaching, and also being a parent as well, I think influences my understanding of students and teaching environments as well. So I wonder what influence that has too.
I'm Demiana, and I do CRT work in a state primary school. And it has been my experience that I am a science teacher, qualified teacher, and I have often walked into classrooms and picked up some books and used my experience to introduce science topics to primary school children. And it's fascinating is whenever I've gone back there, they've asked me, are you going to teach us science? And even if they see me around in the yard, there are a couple of them who would come up, when are you going to come back to our class to teach us science? So what my question is, why is it that we do not have science introduced as a subject in primary so as to inculcate a better love for science in the secondary? Because I find I've done a lot of casual work at the secondary level, and children there have already lost, and you can't kind of draw them towards an interest in science, that even as early as a year 7. I find the motivation in primary, the interest that they have, is absolutely mind-blowing. And many of them who I know are already picking up books on their own and trying to read and get to know more. And I'm sure that some of them will go down that road. And that's my only question is, why is it not introduced even at the primary level?
Did you want to?
I'll have a attempt at answering the question or responding with a few ideas. We do have science in the primary level. It's mandated from foundation through to year 12, but perhaps it's a confidence or a familiarity with the primary teachers. I think they don't necessarily have a lot of confidence and they don't teach it a lot. There is also a much more crowded curriculum in the primary where they have to do everything. The teacher has to teach everything. And in the secondary school, you have the privilege of being a science teacher. And so maybe that's a change. When I was working in the secondary schools, but not in Victoria, I noticed that the kids would tune out from science around Easter time of their first year in high school. And I put it down to the types of teaching and learning activities that they were getting. And by and large, my experience was we have to know all our safety. And so they're not doing anything other than, oh, can we read a thermometer? Big deal. Can we hold the thermometer correctly? And that was what was turning the kids off. But then in Victoria, you've got the added problem of that external exam. So as soon as the child hits high school, it's exam 5 or 6 years' time that drives the teaching. And that's driving away a lot of the creativity and the interest for the child. But that's just my opinion.
There is actually now, Kath, can I ask you, it's an hour of science a week, is that mandated? It's expected. So when did that come in? There's an expectation that teachers will teach about an hour of science a week. And one thing we're noticing, particularly in forming partnerships with some of our partner primary schools, in particular Knox Park Primary, who have developed a partnership with, some of the teachers in particular feel that and want to develop more of the science, awareness of science, interest in science. And so we've actually developed a partnership with Nicole and Andrew, where we bring some of our pre-service teachers here to share and to teach some science lessons, to try and bring in some ideas. So we're developing these partnerships with schools to try and enhance awareness of science, because we know kids love science. Nicole can testify she loves science and she's enthusiastic about it, and where opportunities where she can, she'll bring in science into her classroom. But Nicole's quite confident with her science, but perhaps there might be teachers that may not be as confident with their science, which could be because of the ways in which traditional science teaching has been taught in the past, where it's the nature of science, as I showed you before, that science is a human endeavour. Perhaps they haven't actually thought about the nature of science or been taught about the nature of science, that science knowledge is actually tentative. I mean, when we come up with new understandings, our knowledge of certain concepts changes over time. I mean, look at atomic theory, Deb Corrigan's favourite. Atomic theory changes over time. I mean, look at all the nanotech stuff, the dark matter. There's so many advances in science happening so rapidly, but we tend to have this pervasive idea that science knowledge is static and that it's simply teaching about facts. That's not really the case. We want to start thinking about that and challenging that. Hence the new Science as a Human Endeavour strand in the curriculum, to encourage teachers to think, well, actually, science knowledge is tentative, and scientists do science and they collaborate and they have certain processes, they have peer review, they undergo scrutiny. There are certain processes as part of that. And so maybe there's not necessarily as much awareness or knowledge about the way in which science can be taught, that the teacher is the learner as well. Scientists are learning.
That can actually be quite challenging to your self-identity. And so, and I would also like you to say a little bit more about, I think it is different in primary schools as it is to secondary schools. So I suppose where might your research go in terms of how do you actually cope with this constant state of challenging your equilibrium? Because it actually does then tend to undermine your self-confidence and your self-identity, particularly in science, when you may not, as a primary teacher, be all that confident with it anyway.
Well, I suppose one of the ideas where we're actually teaching as a human endeavour, if we're collaborating with other people, then possibly developing that culture where we're sharing our uncertainty, developing that language and that freedom to be able to talk about it. I would think, well, I would hope, I would want to, and I know I seek out
The critical friend.
colleagues, critical friends, where I can really talk about these things in a messy space, hear them spoken back to me in a way that I can think about it in a different way. But I think that safety is very important, because if we know that everybody else is experiencing the challenge to equilibrium, then we don't feel so alone. So I think primary teachers are quite good at that, collaborating. And so I think that challenging that and encouraging that kind of sharing, because I think everyone else is in the same boat. From what I'm hearing my teachers, the participants actually telling me, is that quite often, and what was quite interesting was some of the more experienced participants were very open and honest about their challenge to equilibrium. And so they would say, oh yes, oh I was a bit worried about this, and oh this one as well, and oh yes, I was really concerned about this. And they were also quite honest about their degree of self-efficacy. So I don't really feel the capacity to be able to necessarily deal with this. But they were quite open about it. So I'm wondering if that sharing would be quite beneficial in that situation. And also in secondary school, because we tend to be quite siloed in our classrooms. I wonder if communities of teachers, faculties of teachers could nurture that kind of culture as well, where they share that. I know I used to go to the staff room quite a bit and talk to colleagues about, oh, I just had this happen. And they go, oh, I had something else like that happen, where we share those moments. But maybe we need to put a bit more of a language on it to actually start then thinking about it in ways that can develop our knowledge of practice.
If I could just follow on from that, we were recently over in Portugal at a conference, and Jen presented part of her research there. Quite a few folk were very impressed by the SRCL model, the chevron, the 4 different stages that you could work through. I think that's got a lot of potential to be worked with the primary teachers, so they've got a framework or a structure that, okay, maybe I'm getting these constant challenges to my identity and my comfort zone, but if I take a step back, look for a moment, see what I've got to do here, have a go at it, and they've got a structure to work through, that might help as well.
Daily teaching is pretty busy. So do we need to start challenging these notions for the people that allocate the time? Do we need more time allocated to this? Because if we're not seeing that valued in terms of time, in terms of opportunities for teachers to share, will the teachers then share it? Will the teachers value it as much? So if it was actually given more value by management, maybe?
I myself, as a biologist, and I'm now in teaching, but when I was at Monash Uni, we have that, I think it's a culture of the department, I was in biological science, that every week we used to have a research meeting, and everyone in the lab, they come and they discuss their problems, that I have this problem this week.
Is it in the science faculty?
It was in
Yeah.
So we have those things, and sometimes my supervisor or sometimes my undergraduate students come with the idea, you can try this or you can try this. That meeting was only for that. I think in a school, now we have online system, so all the administrative tasks can be done through emails, and science or departmental meetings should be, come and share your interruptions and everyone discuss those things in that. So you develop a culture within the school that every department is discussing their interruptions, and no one is the odd one that I'm the only one with this problem.
Because everyone brings one to the table.
And
Yes.
everyone have to bring one.
And we certainly have plenty of meeting times.
Yeah.
So there is scope to do that more in some of the meeting times in schools. Great idea, yeah.
I'd just like to give the opportunity for one more question. Great.
Hi there, I'm Rohani. I'm a math teacher, however, at secondary level. I'm just curious, in your research, when interruptions happen among teachers, you were talking about, and I see this from an ideal perspective as well, that when interruptions happen, we try and seek solutions to our challenge. Probably in more cases, maybe one is already too many, I think. Teachers, when they are interrupted, they just like, shoo away.
Yes.
You know, just like delete, click, and gone. It's like disappeared. So I'm just curious, like from your interactions with the participants, probably these are the cream of the crop of the teachers, perhaps? I don't know.
No, there was definitely not. Well, teachers that like talking about their practice tend to self-select for studies, so it is biased in that regard. In that the teachers were happy to talk about their practice, but they did mention, and there was particularly when organising for learning, there was often moments when teachers said, I can't. Organising for teaching, sorry, you know, where I had assessment and depth versus breadth. There was often moments where they said, I can't solve this. So because teaching is dilemma-based, dilemmas, we manage them, we don't necessarily solve them. And so teachers, I can only manage it as best I can, but it's ongoing. I will always feel like this. I don't feel like I have any control over it. And so that's where it sort of simmers and stays as something that's ongoing. And so yes, they were quite open in saying, this is the system I'm in, sort of a hands up moment, this is what I have, I'll just have to, it's one of those things that'll just keep going. And they were a little bit philosophical about that and a little bit disappointed in that they felt that there are just some things in their context they just can't manage to the way they would like to manage it. And so yeah, there was quite often moments where they didn't have a resolution. And there were also moments when teachers chose not to necessarily notice. And so this is why in the research you might have noticed at the bottom of the SRCL I asked them to rate their degree of discontent, their degree of self-efficacy, my belief in my ability to address it, and also their care factor. I called it care factor. It was interest. So how interested are you in actually addressing this? And it was very interesting that some teachers said, oh, I'm not really interested. Like, oh, you know, I have to manage, I have to include all of this stuff, and I feel I have to include all of these things from the curriculum, and I feel I'm not doing it well, but I really don't care because I'm really covering this in a lot of detail and the kids are really on board and I feel like the learning is very valuable. So yes, I should be doing this. So my care factor is pretty low, but I'm pretty happy with where the kids are at. So that degree of professionalism was there as well. So that was very interesting, but absolutely teachers said, yep, I can't manage this, I'll just have to live with it.
Many thanks. Many thanks to all of you for your great questions. I'd love you to join with me again to thank Jen and Gil for joining us.
Thank you.
And I'd also really like to thank Andrew and the team here at Knox Park Primary for
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Nicole.
this beautiful space. And thanks to our marketing team as well. And as I said, this is the 3rd out of 5 in our Science Education Seminar Series. The next one comes up on the 15th of September. We're going out to the other side of town. We'll be out at Holy Child Primary School out at Dallas. And we're tapping into my colleague Kathy Smith and myself into primary science education and really offering some alternative ways of thinking about science learning and teaching in that space and what it looks like and what it can look like. So we'd love to see you out there. So thanks again for being here tonight and for your good questions and being part of this.